I've already road tested the car with the owner, Jack. This car steers hard and it wanders a little.
Notice anything special, George?
Well, I checked the front and rear tire pressures on the way to the owner's office. The tires were up to snuff.
I hope you told the owner how important proper tire pressure is to easy steering.
Oh, sure, Tech. I never pass up a chance to drive that point home. Another thing, these tires don't show any unusual wear, so this job isn't a case of misalignment.
How about lubrication?
Not a chance, Jack. This guy's had his car greased every time he got a haircut, according to all the stickers.
Now slow down, George. Sometimes the kingpins are overlooked and don't get lubricated. That could cause a bind.
You're right, Tech. I'd better take a good gander at the whole steering system.
All right, George, but don't forget, you're supposed to keep your sprained wrist wrapped up another day. So how about a helper for any heavy work?
Well, all right. But make it somebody who knows something. I'll put the car in the stall and we can get going.
Hi, George. Jack said between your brains and my brawn, we could fix a steering gear, maybe.
Yeah, Lefty. I could use a little muscle. A little brain muscle wouldn't hurt either.
Your worries are over, then. I've forgotten more about steering than you'll ever know.
Well, that I gotta see. If you're so smart, what's at the other end of the steering tube that this steering wheel is riding on?
That's a snap, George. There's a big fat worm. And it's no ordinary worm, either. This one's shaped like those old-fashioned coursers. When the steering wheel turns, the worm turns.
Okay, Lefty. What's in mesh with the worm?
It's a roller on a shaft. But I forget exactly how it goes together.
Now, ain't that just too bad? Seems our memory marvel's lost his touch. You better let me take over, son. In mesh with that worm gear is a roller mounted on a steering gear cross shaft. That shaft is at right angles to the worm and turns as the worm gear turns.
Oh, yeah, I remember now. There's a steering gear arm called a pitman arm, connected to the cross shaft. On the other end of the pitman arm are two tie rods. These tie rods are connected to the steering knuckle arms which turn the front wheels. The steering knuckles are held in place by Kingpin.
That's correct, Lefty. The steering knuckle and Kingpin are just like a big hinge on which the wheel swings to the right or left. But you know, George ought to fill in with a little more dope on that roller travel in the gearbox.
What Tech's driving at, Lefty, is that while the roller meshes with the worm, the center line of the roller is offset slightly from the center line of the worm, and that offset allows adjustment for depth of mesh. With the adjusting screw, you can move the roller closer to the worm's center line to reduce backlash.
Yeah, that's the way I recall it. And you don't get the same backlash all along the worm.
Right. You see, the arc formed by the hourglass shape of the worm is flatter than the arc traveled by the roller. And so when the roller travels up or down the worm, it pulls out of mesh slightly, and a little backlash begins to come in after the roller travels about 4 degrees away from the center.
In fact, Lefty, the farther the roller moves away from the center of the worm, the greater the backlash becomes.
That's actually a safety factor, Lefty. You see, since the roller and worm arcs are different, you can adjust for wear at the center, where most driving is done. But if the arcs were the same, and you tried to adjust for wear at the center, the roller would bind on turns.
That would sure keep you traveling in circles, Lefty. The steering wheel wouldn't straighten out by itself.
I suppose this steering layout's the same on the Dodge, eh, George?
Yeah, but on Chryslers and DeSoto's, the pitman arm is connected to the tie rods through a drag link and intermediate arm. This gives you tie rods of equal length to each wheel.
Hey, you guys will never fix this job with your jaws, so how about getting to work?
Okay. Let's raise it up and take a look underneath. You've got the right idea, Lefty. Disconnecting that pitman arm from the cross shaft is easier than disconnecting the front wheels from the steering gear.
Right, George.
Now, the steering wheel turns freely, so everything's okay down to the pitman arm.
But what if the steering wheel was binding?
Well, in that case, you'd loosen the steering post bracket cap to see if the steering column was forced out of line. You see, the steering column should line up with the bracket without having to force the column into position. But if you do have to raise a column, loosen the mounting bolts that hold the steering gear housing to the car frame. Then you can shift the housing in the oversized mounting holes so the column will meet the bracket.
Of course, if the column is out of line on account of being sprung, it makes the steering tube and worm work under a strain. Even Lefty ought to know that.
Oh, listen, Tech, I know more than that. Besides the strain on the tube, you'll get a bind in the column jacket bushing, which acts as a guide for the tube. If I ever had to check a sprung column, I'd see how freely the steering assembly turned. If it's free, there's no damage inside the column or housing, right?
Well, I'll be doggone. You do know a little about steering. Suppose you find a bind and yet the column does line up with the bracket.
Well, there are two possible sources of trouble. The bushing at the top of the steering column may be too tight. Or maybe there aren't enough shims between the bottom cover and the steering gear housing. This puts too much preload on the worm bearings.
That's the ticket, Lefty. And if the column jacket bushing were too tight, you'd remove the steering wheel and loosen the steering post bracket cap. That lets you slide the steering column jacket up so the bushing is above the end of the worm tube. Then, you can free up the bushing with a rat tail file.
Of course, if that bushing was damaged, you'd replace it.
I see. I suppose you can add shims if you figure you got too much preload on the worm bearings.
Right. And besides that, the roller may be adjusted too tight in the worm. This can also cause hard steering. In a case of this kind, use another pitman arm to get the right feel of backlash as you adjust the roller. Then make sure the roller is in the center of the worm. Turn the adjusting screw out until you feel a little backlash. Then turn the screw in just enough to eliminate the backlash.
I see. That gives you proper backlash adjustment. But that doesn't wrap up all the possible causes of binding in the tube and worm.
No, you're right. I had a case a few months ago. On that car, there was a tight spot at one point when I made a complete revolution of the steering wheel. A tight spot usually means the tube and worm are bent and ought to be replaced. But you gotta pull the steering gear out to make sure.
Right. Now let's turn the record over and we'll tell you what to look for when you're overhauling the steering gear.
Now, on that other job I was telling you about, Lefty, I got the steering gear over to the bench and disassembled the gear. Then I looked over the worm and roller teeth for signs of scoring. Scored teeth, of course, called for replacement. Next, I inspected the bearings for wear. You naturally would replace those if they're worn. Well, the teeth were pretty fair, and the bearings okay, but then I spotted the steering tube, and oh boy, there was the worst-looking kink I ever saw, right above the top thrust bearing.
How'd that happen?
I don't know for sure, maybe a collision, or maybe just some circus strongman showing off his muscle by forcing that column jacket in place during installation.
Was it a new car, George?
Oh, no, it had a lot of miles on it, and looked like it might have been in a wreck at some time. This damage happened quite a while back.
And George, isn't it smart to adjust the steering tube and worm bearings before installing the cross shaft and roller?
Oh, sure, Tech. That's what I did. After that, I used a spring scale on the rim of the steering wheel to check the bearing adjustment. You know, it should take 3/8 to 3/4 of a pound pull to turn the steering wheel. And when I installed the cross shaft and roller, I made sure I got a pull of 1 to 2.5 pounds on the scale.
Another thing, Lefty. George wrapped tape over the threads and splines of the tube before sliding the column jacket over the tube to prevent damage to the bushing.
That's a good idea, Tech. I'll keep it in mind. But let's get back to this car, George, where we found no stiffness in the steering assembly. Where are you figuring on looking next?
At the Kingpins, Lefty, which is what we'd better do right now. A binding condition might not show up when the wheels are free, but comes in when the weight of the car is on the Kingpins. That's why we set the front wheels on turntables.
Hope you didn't forget to check those turntables before you use them, Lefty. They've got to be clean and well oiled so they're absolutely free.
I've checked them already, Tech. They're all right.
Well, now, let's turn the wheels by hand. And you want to keep in mind that if the wheels turn hard and don't start to turn back into straight-ahead position when you let them go, it means the Kingpins or the tie rods are binding.
These turned kind of hard, George.
Well, then let's unhook the tie rods from the steering arms and try each wheel by itself. Now, if either wheel still turns hard, you'll know the bind is in the Kingpin. But if the wheel turns freely and binds again when you hook up the tie rod, it means the binding is in the tie rod ends.
That makes sense to me. Well, the other wheel turns free, but this one turns hard. So the bind is in this Kingpin.
Uh-huh. Might as well get it out and start the fixing.
Look at how this pin and bushing have scored. And no wonder there wasn't enough grease in the bushing.
While you've got that thrust bearing out, better check it to be sure there are no flat spots.
Okay, I will. You know, it's funny these parts should be scored. The owners had the car greased often enough.
You're right, George. Buddy might have had the car greased with the weight on the front wheels, and the grease didn't get into the bushing.
Yeah, Tech, that's right. We'd better put in new bushings and a new pin, Lefty.
And be sure to get a good fit when you ream those bushings.
Okay, Tech. I'll watch that. You know, George, a new pin and bushings ought to take care of this case.
Oh, we're not finished, my boy. We got to check those tie rod ends to be sure we've covered all the bases.
How in blazes can you get any trouble from those tie rod ends? They're ball and socket connections.
You're right, Lefty. But if you get one socket cocked toward the front and the other one cocked toward the rear, when you tighten the clamps, the socket edges will bind on the studs, and that'll give you hard steering.
Don't forget to check toe in before you turn this job loose.
Right, Tech. On this model, Lefty, you're supposed to have 0 toe-in. Up to a 16th is okay if you can't get 0. Always check the toe-in specifications for the model you're working on.
I'm a little rusty on wheel alignment. Where does toe out come into the picture?
On turns, Lefty. You see, when a car goes around a corner, the inside wheel makes a smaller circle. That means the inside wheel has to be turned at a greater angle than the outside wheel. For example, when the outside wheel is turned 20 degrees, the inside wheel should show 21.5 degrees, plus or minus 1 degree.
I remember that now, George. You also get the same difference in the turning angles of each wheel, whether you turn to the right or left, huh?
Yeah, that's toe out, and it's about the same either way. If you don't get that, it's because something's bent, usually a steering knuckle arm. So, replace the arm. Don't try to straighten anything.
That's a good tip, Tech, and that goes for all the parts in the steering system. They're made of heat-treated steel, Lefty. Reheating them to straighten them ruins the original temper and makes them too weak to use safely. So don't take a chance. Replace any bent parts.
Okay. Now, what do you do when there's too much lost motion in the steering wheel?
Well, that could mean end play due to loose worm bearings. Here's how I check it. Hold the steering wheel hub so your thumb is pressing on the end of the hub and on the column jacket. If there's end play in the worm, you'll feel the hub move up and down when I shake the front wheels.
The tube didn't move, George, so it's okay.
Yeah, but if the worm bearings had been loose, you'd have had to remove a shim or two from between the cover and the housing to tighten those bearings.
But be sure to leave enough shims in so you don't cause a grease leak.
Suppose everything's free enough on a hoist, but tightens up when you set the car down on its wheels. What then?
I'd suspect a tight roller in the cross shaft, Lefty. You can't tell that with the car weight off its wheels. The roller will slide up and down the worm without binding, even if it isn't turning on its bearing. But when the car weight is on its wheels, that roller's got to turn on its bearing as it travels on the worm. If it doesn't, you'll have hard steering. So if everything checks out, but the car still steers hard, remove the cross shaft and try to turn the roller tooth.
Don't expect that roller to turn easily, Lefty. It's fitted fairly tight to take out all play. If you can turn the roller at all with your hand, the bearing is okay.
Okay, George. Now that we got this car buttoned up, what are you thinking of doing?
I'm going to take it out and road test it. Got to be extra careful on steering jobs because...
Yeah, I know. The old safety angle. And this reference book I swiped from your bench makes quite a point of safety.
Ho-ho! No wonder you sounded so darn smart. Well, keep that book a while, Lefty. Anybody who works on steering ought to keep safety first in mind.
You're so right, fellas. 'Cause when an owner gets behind the wheel, that steering hookup better be perfect. A lot of lives can depend on how well a car steers. And who knows, one of those lives might be your own.